Architectures of multi-agent systems. Here I'm showing you the work of Daniel Bolojan. Um, this is an example of stigmergy. Stigmergy is defined in the dictionary as the mechanism of spontaneous indirect coordination between agents or actions, where the trace left in the environment by an action stimulates the performance of a subsequent action. In many ways, it's following the logic of the pheromone trail. This is the kind of work that has really been spawned by the use of multi-agent systems. Daniel Bolojan writes his own algorithms. He doesn't use processing. But what we're getting is this astonishing effect. And this, in a way, is why architects were so fascinated by the use of multi-agent systems. It opened up a whole new dimension, a whole new way of thinking about design. Curiously, many of these architects who are working on swarm intelligence are now working on artificial intelligence, as though the next step is to go and to work with artificial intelligence itself. Daniel Bolojan is one of the leading experts in artificial intelligence, as we've seen in some of the other lectures. In fact, one could say that there are certain limitations to the use of swarm intelligence. What level of intelligence does it actually possess? And if it has any intelligence, and it does have some intelligence, it's a relatively low-level intelligence compared to, say, what we find in deep learning. Nonetheless, it does produce some astonishing work. There are, of course, ways in which one can use swarm intelligence in a kind of performative way. Swarm particle optimization is one of the techniques that has been used to optimize the facade of buildings, for example. But much of the work we put into the Swarm Intelligence book was not based on that. It was really about opening up new ways of expressing themselves, new forms of architecture itself. Let me show you then some of the kind of work that has been coming out by some of the cutting edge architects in this domain. Elisa Andrescheck has been one of the leaders, one of the pioneers. She was many years ago one of my students at Columbia. She's now a professor at RMIT, but she's taught all over the world, and she taught Roland Stoxx. Her work is exquisite in many ways. One thing you can say about Elisa is that she always produces something that looks astonishing. This is the project she calls Invisibles. It's a form of inverse kinematics. On the left-hand side, you can see the kind of mechanism, as it were, that is clothed on the right-hand side. It is the inverse kinematics is kind of, you think of it almost like the way that an elbow joint works, how one operation then it has an influence on the entire assembly of operations. Of course, this is not built as such, but nonetheless, this kind of exploratory work has really been pushing the boundaries of what we might find, what we might call the most progressive forms of architectural expression. Elisa's work has also been using other other systems to go and to produce these things. This is an electromagnetic field that was used for her Sarusi pavilion. And she's also been using multi-agent systems in particular. This is a project that she did with Jose Sanchez, using these agents to go and define a kind of canyon-like operation. You can see the agents then kind of tracing this kind of this pathway that then itself becomes consolidated into a kind of panel facade or something. What is it for? We don't know exactly. It's not necessarily a kind of pragmatic thing. It's not necessarily trying to define a functional building, but rather it's trying to open up the possibility of what architectural expression might be. And in many ways, this is really what has been happening with the exploration of these new techniques. That is, in a sense, pushing the boundaries, opening up possibilities beyond those that we might ourselves envisage. In other words, in many ways, like AI itself, swarm intelligence becomes a kind of a muse that opens up and suggests things that we would otherwise not have thought about. This then has been the kind of work that has been largely coming out of this particular kind of system, exploratory work, progressive work, not necessarily pragmatic work, not necessarily feeding into a kind of the professional discourse of architecture, but certainly pushing the boundaries of what might be possible in terms of architecture itself. This is some work that she produced when she was teaching at the UCL Bartlett. She had a studio called Wonderlab. Of course, Elisa, her name means Alice, Alice in Wonderland, and always what you can find with the work produced by Elisa is that and her students is that it looks exquisite, and this essentially is what they've been looking for, trying to find ways of producing exquisite looking work. This is a 3D printed study and so on. Roland Stoxx was himself a student of Elisa's. This is one of his projects for a mace for RMIT in Australia, the leading school of architecture. And it's a mace that was generated, the pattern was generated using multi-agent systems and then 3D printed in titanium. In many ways, one of the challenges of working with multi-agent systems is they are basically agents that leave traces. They leave traces, therefore you can define lines and so on, but they don't necessarily lend themselves to being architectural forms if you think of an architectural form as being something that is bounded by certain planes. But nonetheless, they can open up possibilities of how we might reimagine architecture. This is a project for a museum in Korea that points towards the possibility of how ravishingly exquisite some of this work can be. Another project that that was done in collaboration with Tom Wiscombe, who teaches at SciArc, a kind of what he calls messy computation, where you use computation, then you intervene with your manually, as it were. So it's a combination of what the computer might throw out, the possibilities that we wouldn't have imagined, and then human manipulation, making it into a building. And then further work coming out of Roland Stoxx's studio. He's now a professor at RMIT in Melbourne himself. And looking also at the possibility of robotic fabrication using these techniques to produce this kind of work. And this is the work of his students some time back using processing. This is work from the students from UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. And then more recent work from his students in RMIT. Gilles Retzin was also a student of Elisa's at the AADRL, and he is now a professor at the Bartlett. This is one of his projects that he did when he was at the DRL. And finally, let me just mention briefly that the work of Satoru Sugihara, who was also working on multi-agent system. He was teaching at SciArc for many years and collaborating with Tom Main of Morphosis. In fact, this building by Morphosis, this facade here is generated using a multi-agent system. So although on the whole this hasn't been used in terms of the profession of architecture and in terms of the pragmatics of building, nonetheless it has that potential, and Satoru is still working as a consultant for a number of architects producing a project such as this. Swarm intelligence then has its place in the history of architecture as something that really opened up a new way of thinking and new forms of expression. It might be being eclipsed by artificial intelligence now, but nonetheless, in many ways, it set the scene for artificial intelligence.